Have you ever met someone who truly heard you, without a single word spoken? In the dry heart of 1880s Texas, a lonely rancher named Caleb Mercer made a choice no man expected. At a dusty auction yard, he bought not just a broken-down mare, but a young woman the world had already given up on, Elara Quinn, a girl sold by her own father,
Ever see a sci-fi?
silent and deaf, or so they
I've been
thought.
meaning to talk to you about something
But what if
important.
she wasn't deaf at all? What if she could hear something deeper? The pulse of storm before they struck, the ache behind a man's silence, the heartbeat of a land burdened by guilt and grace. Would you have walked away, or would you have listened not with your ears, but with your heart? This is not just a Western story. It's a story about loneliness, meeting understanding, about two souls who found a language deeper than sound, and love that asked for nothing but truth. Stay with us, because once you hear their silence, you'll never forget it. If this story touches your heart, please like, share, and subscribe, and let's begin the journey of the rancher and the girl who heard the heart of the world. Texas, 1881. Late sun baked the boards of Abilene's Market Street until the dust seemed hammered into the grain. Horses tossed their heads, cattle complained in low waves, and men haggled with whiskey breath and scuffed boots, while the final livestock lot slipped under the auctioneer's voice. At the edge of a thinning crowd, a bay mare quivered behind the corral gate, ribs showing like slats. Old blood dried along her flank. Caleb Mercer tipped his hat to cut the glare and measured her with a quiet, practical eye. 35, lean and weathered. He was a man carved out of fence lines and long rides, the kind who spoke to stock more than to people. He had come for a horse and nothing else. Then he saw the girl. She stood just beyond the rails, maybe 19, hair stuck to her cheek, hem torn, soles bare and caked in street dust. She made no sound. Her eyes drifted, not lost, not vacant, but tracking something finer than motion, as if the world hummed on a thread only she could feel. A man swayed beside her with a bottle in one fist and a rope in the other. The rope cinched her wrist. "Got a dumb one here," the drunk crowed to whoever would listen. "She don't talk, don't hear, but she works, cheap." A few men laughed the way men do when they want to sound hard. Caleb turned as if to walk away. He was not here for trouble. He wanted the mare and the road home. But the girl looked at him. It was not a plea. It was not even a hope. It was steady, level, clear. In that look, Caleb felt something tighten, a shape he recognized from his own quiet life. Understanding, maybe, or the long ache of being alone. The drunk lurched closer. "You got coin. Rancher? Take the horse. Take her. I ain't dragging her back." The mare blew foam and pawed. The girl's gaze did not waver. Caleb faced the man. "I will take both." Rough laughter bobbed up from the fence line. "You buying stock or building yourself a harem?" Mercer Caleb answered no one. He counted out silver. Enough for a horse. Never enough for a person. The man shoved the rope at him. The girl flinched and stepped behind Caleb on her own, small and deliberate. "You feed her now." The drunk slurred, grinning mean. Caleb dropped the rope into the dust. He led the bay out, and the girl followed without a word, the frayed shawl slipping on her shoulders. At his wagon, she paused, waiting, eyes on him, but not asking. He set down the tailboard and motioned to the bed.
It's all right. I've got
She
you.
climbed in and folded herself into a corner like she had been practicing invisibility a long time. As he swung up to the bench, he felt a light tug on his coat. Her fingers, rough from scrub work, brushed the fabric once and fell away. She did not meet his eyes. She turned toward the far line of hills. It was not thanks. It was trust, thin as a thread and somehow stronger than rope. Caleb snapped the reins. The wagon rattled out of Abilene, wheels ticking over hardpan. They passed mesquite and low stone rises, the sky unrolling big and empty, the kind of country that lets a man hear his own thoughts whether he wants to or not. The girl curled beneath a blanket and watched the wind. She never looked back. He did not either. Mercer Ranch lay west of town, a slant roof house, a few sheds, and a sweep of grass where beef shaded under open sky. It was plain and clean and, until that day, enough. He helped her down, slow in case she spooked. But she stepped easy, scanning the yard like she was making a map in her head. In the kitchen, he knocked ashes from the stove and tapped the kettle. She moved without prompting, found the tin cups, and set water to heat, not guessing, not fumbling, just working like she knew what went where. They ate simple and quiet. After, Caleb stepped to a cupboard and took out a stub of chalk. He tapped the pine doorframe by the table and spoke slow, more out of habit than hope. Name. She studied him a long beat, then she crouched and wrote, careful and slanted, a single word. Elara. He read it once. Then again.
I see a sci-fi.
Elara. He said it out loud,
to talk to you about something
testing
important.
the shape in the air. She did not smile, but she stood and walked to the barn as if she had been given a direction she already intended to take. Morning found her in the stable beside the broken-down bay. The mare had barely touched feed. One hind leg was puffy from an old strain. Elara soaked a rag and smoothed it along the trembling flank, her hands moving in a rhythm that was not speech but carried the same kind of meaning. She wrapped the leg with patient loops. The horse breathed through it and kept still. Caleb watched from the door, arms crossed. He had seen hands get kicked for less, but the mare leaned into the quiet. Maybe the girl could not hear the way others did. That did not mean she missed anything. He set her to chores that day. Floorboards, boil water, tidy the tack room. She worked straight through without a sound. That night, she left chalk notes in tight letters along the doorframe, the way a person might tuck seeds in a row. Bacon low, dog limps. Wind tastes like dust. The house felt different. Not noisy, not crowded. Lived in. When the sun slid down behind the ridge, Caleb stepped out and looked across the pasture. He could feel the long stretch of his life behind him. All those years of fences and storms and the kind of silence that makes a man forget the shape of his own voice. He glanced back toward the kitchen where the chalk still showed her name, like a small flag planted in his world. Elara Quinn. He said it again. Softer. Out in the dark. The bay shifted straw. A breeze lifted and died. Caleb shut the door against the night and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the place might hold more than cattle and weather. It might hold two people learning how to listen. Morning came soft and pale over the Abilene plains, but the wind already carried a nervous edge inside the stable. Elara Quinn knelt beside the wounded bay mare, her palms moving slow and certain over the horse's trembling flank. She dampened a rag and stroked the mare's side in quiet rhythm, not whispering words, not using signs, just the patient motion of someone who could hear the world through her hands. At the doorway, Caleb Mercer leaned against the post with his arms crossed. He had seen ranch hands with years of experience get their teeth knocked out for trying to wrap a horse in pain, but the mare stayed calm beneath Elara's touch. The air between them was still, like they had struck a kind of truce neither had spoken aloud. That day, Caleb gave her chores around the house, mopped the floors, boil water, scrubbed the tack room. She moved through them like she had done it 100 times, her silence never heavy. When the sun dipped low, he found chalk marks along the doorframe again, neat and small. Bacon nearly gone. Dog favoring left leg. Wind smells like rain. He ran his thumb over the words. Her world didn't need sound. It had texture, pattern, and attention sharper than most men carried in their bones. Days passed that way, quiet and steady, until the sky turned wrong. It started with heat thick, uneasy air that pressed down on the land. The breeze came at sundown, hot and restless, stirring the tall grass like a whisper you couldn't quite catch. Caleb glanced toward the horizon and saw a thin bruise of clouds far off. But storms were part of life in Texas. He kept on working. He was checking on a sick calf when she appeared, barefoot, breathless. Her hair clung to her temples, her eyes wide with something between fear and certainty. She grabbed his sleeve, pulling hard. "What is it?" he asked, startled. She pointed upward. Her hands trembled, but her gaze didn't. Her eyes said everything her lips couldn't move. Now. He hesitated, half bent over the calf, but something in her face made him listen. She tugged him again toward the barn doors, away from the corral. Then the world split open. A flash brighter than noon lit the yard, followed by a crack that shook the dirt under their boots. A bolt of lightning tore through the old oak behind the cattle shed. The blast ripped bark and flame into the sky. Caleb stumbled back as the air filled with smoke and sparks. The tree was burning, hissing like something alive. The calves bawled in terror. Elara stood just outside the doorway, her face pale in the firelight, her breath coming fast, but her eyes were calm. She had known, not after the thunder, not after the wind. Before. Caleb stepped toward her, dazed. "How did you—" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence between them was enough. That night, after the flames were out and the cattle had settled, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table. No chalk, no writing. Just two people who had seen the same fire and somehow survived it. Caleb rested his hands flat on the wood, his fingers twitching with thoughts he couldn't say. She folded her hands in her lap, eyes steady, patient. He looked at her for a long time and finally said, "Elara." She met his gaze. No sound came from her, but he could feel her answer in the way she breathed, the way her stillness spoke. It was enough. After that night, Caleb started paying attention to things he had ignored for years, the way the wind shifted before rain, how the cattle moved when a front rolled in, the subtle rhythm of the land. He found himself glancing at her without meaning to, wondering what she knew that he didn't. Elara never wrote more than she had to. She never asked for anything, never tried to explain herself. But every so often, she moved with a kind of purpose that made Caleb stop and watch. One cold morning, the lead cow stood apart from the herd, head low. Caleb assumed it was the chill. "We'll see by evening," he muttered to himself. But Elara had already crossed the pasture, her shawl fluttering in the wind. She gathered straw into the birthing stall, fetched water scented with mint from the well, and knelt beside the cow, her palm smoothing the animal's side. By sunset, the cow was in labor. She had known again. Somehow. Always. She knew. Caleb didn't question it, not out loud, but that night, while the wind rattled the shutters, he lay awake listening to the quiet hum of the ranch, wondering what kind of world lived behind her silence. A few days later, he rode into Abilene. The town sat half asleep under the weight of gossip and grit. At the sheriff's office, Old stories resurfaced rumors about land deeds, debts, and the Mercer family name tangled with blood and broken promises from the war. The sheriff spoke in half-truths and warnings, the kind that stuck under a man's skin. By the time Caleb returned home, the sky was streaked with rust and gold. He unsaddled in silence, his shoulders tight, his mind heavy with ghosts. He sat on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, watching the horizon fade. Elara came quietly, as she always did. She didn't ask. She just stood beside him until the stillness felt shared instead of lonely. Then she placed her hand on his shoulder, light and sure, grounding him back into the earth. He stared at the dirt for a long moment before speaking. His voice cracked like an old hinge. "How did you know," he whispered, "about the land, about the shame of it?" She didn't move at first. Then she turned her hand and laid it gently against his chest, right over his heart. The gesture was simple, but it hit deeper than any sermon. After a while, she walked away, toward the field's edge where a lone oak stood, his father's grave beneath it. She hadn't read the headstone. She couldn't have. But somehow she knew where to go. That night, Caleb dreamed of cannon fire and the smoke of old battles. He saw his father again, proud and trembling, his voice a rough echo through the haze. "I gave you this land, Caleb," the old man said, "and I gave you the blood that keeps it." Caleb woke with a start, breath ragged. The fire in the hearth had burned low, throwing long shadows across the cabin. And there she was, Elara, sitting in a chair by the light of a single candle. The flame caught her profile, half shadow, half grace. On the table beside her sat a small blue handkerchief trimmed with lace. His mother's, long lost, locked away in a cedar chest no one had opened in 10 years. He froze. How did you find that?" Elara didn't answer. She didn't even look at him. She rose, quiet as snowfall, and crossed the room to the door. For a moment, her hand rested on the frame. Then she stepped out into the cold night. Caleb sat there a long time, staring at the candle and the folded cloth beside it. Somehow she had pulled that memory out of a place even he couldn't reach. It wasn't magic. It wasn't madness. It was something else, something that made him realize that silence could hold more truth than all the words he'd ever spoken. For the first time, he understood that the girl who could not hear had been listening all along, not to voices or thunder, but to the ache in the earth, the breath between heartbeats,
I've been meaning to talk to you about
and the weight
something
a man
important.
carries when he's been too long alone. And in that understanding, Caleb Mercer felt something shift inside him. The loneliness he'd worn like armor began to loosen. He whispered into the dim room, voice barely a breath. "She hears what no one else does." Outside, the wind moved through the mesquite, and the ranch settled back into its rhythm, a silence no longer empty, but full of something alive. The wind outside Mercer Ranch had stilled after days of unease. Night crept in soft, the kind that could fool a man into thinking peace had finally settled over his land. But Caleb Mercer couldn't sleep. The candle beside his bed burned low, its light casting gold on the table, where a blue handkerchief rested faded, hand-stitched with delicate lace, his mother's. He hadn't seen it in 10 years. It had been sealed away inside the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, locked since the day he buried her. No one had touched it. He sat up slowly, his chest tight. How Elara Quinn stood near the door, her figure quiet in the candlelight. She didn't look at him, didn't move to explain. She simply turned and stepped into the cold hallway, her bare feet silent against the floorboards. Caleb stared after her, the air heavy with something unspoken. She had heard something inside him, not with ears, but with whatever strange compass guided her heart. What she heard wasn't sound, it was memory, the ache of a son's guilt, the echo of a mother's touch he'd buried beneath work and solitude. Somehow, through all that quiet, Elara had found it and laid it before him, unspoken proof that she understood. And for the first time, Caleb feared losing her. Not his land, not his father's legacy, not even his soul, but her. The one person who seemed to know what he felt before he dared admit it himself. The whispers started soon after. The first came from Mrs. Cobb, the blacksmith's wife, as she folded laundry on her porch. "She stares too long at the cattle," she murmured, voice sharp as wire, like she knows which one will die next. By week's end, the preacher's son added his own rumor to the fire. "She touched our goat," he said, eyes wide. 2 days later, birthed early. That ain't right. No one had ever heard Elara speak, and her silence gave the town all the space it needed to fill her story with fear. At the general store, a woman clutched her child and stepped aside when Elara passed, though all the girl did was buy flour. At the post, a man spat near her feet. Elara kept her eyes down, her basket close to her chest. She never flinched, never argued. But Caleb saw the way her fingers gripped the handle tighter, how her steps turned softer, like she was trying to vanish into the earth itself. He said nothing, neither did she. The quiet between them was no longer peace. It was armor. One afternoon, a ranch hand's boy came down with a fever that wouldn't break. The doctor was gone east, and his mother wept beside the cot in their barn. When Caleb arrived, Elara was already there. She hadn't asked permission. She didn't need to. Kneeling beside the child, she laid one hand on his chest, another on his forehead, and closed her eyes. For a moment, the only sound was the boy's ragged breath. Then Elara rose and walked out into the yard. She cut sprigs of lavender, feverfew, and rabbit tobacco from Caleb's drying wall. Back inside, she boiled them into a steeped brew, pressing a hot cloth to the boy's neck, then lifting his head to drink. By dawn, the fever broke. The child sat up, weak but smiling. His mother clung to Elara's hands, tears falling. But by the next morning, the same mother was whispering at the well. She didn't even ask what the boy's symptoms were. How did she know? How did she know? The questions turned into fear, and fear turned into anger. 3 days later, they came. 8 townsfolk, men and women, trudged through the thawing mud to Mercer Ranch. They carried unlit torches, but their faces burned with certainty. At their head was Mr. Harlan Pike, a man whose own daughter hadn't spoken to him in years. He stopped at the gate and called out, "We want her gone." Caleb stepped out from the barn, his beard rough, eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. "Why she hears things she ought not," Pike said, his jaw set. "You think it's right. The way she knows. Before it happens, she's not deaf. Mercer, she's cursed. She's mute," Caleb replied, his voice calm but hard. "That ain't the same thing," Pike snapped. "A steer of mine dropped dead last week. She touched it the day before. You call that chance, I call it evil." A murmur rolled through the crowd like dry thunder. Inside the cabin, Elara stood behind the curtain. She didn't need words to understand what was happening. She had seen the dust on their boots, the way they held their torches like promises they hoped to keep. Caleb raised a hand before she could step outside. He moved toward the gate, his boots sinking in the mud. "She saved a child's life," he said evenly. Maybe she gave him the fever to start with. A woman hissed from the back. Caleb's gaze swept across them all. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. She listens, he said, not with her ears, with her hands, with her breath, with everything she is. And you call that witchcraft. The wind stirred between them, carrying his words through the still air. I've lived 35 years, he went on, and I can count on one hand the people who've ever truly heard me, not my words, but my silence, my regret, my grief. She did, without speaking a single one. His jaw tightened. You're scared because she sees the world you refuse to look at. You want her gone. You'll have to go through me. No one moved. Pike's mouth opened, then shut again. The others shifted, looking at one another. A long minute passed, then another. Finally, one by one, they turned back toward the road. The torches went unlit. Their boots left deep, heavy tracks in the wet earth, fading toward Abilene. That night, the ranch was quieter than ever. Only the wind spoke through the chimneys. Caleb sat at the table, his face half lit by the fire. Elara moved about the kitchen, setting a pot of cider on to warm. When she placed a cup in front of him, she didn't sign, didn't write, didn't meet his eyes. But then, softly, she set her hand on his. It wasn't thanks. It was recognition. He turned his palm upward and laced his fingers around hers. Neither spoke. They just listened to the crackle of the fire, the sigh of the wind, the heartbeat of a house that had seen too much loneliness for too long. Outside, snow began to fall, slow and soundless, covering the scars the day had left behind. It fell over the ranch, over the fields, over the graves, inside, under the dim flicker of the hearth. Caleb Mercer and Elara Quinn sat hand in hand, two souls who had learned the rarest language of all. They didn't need words. They had silence, and in that silence, something like love had begun to speak. Winter had carved its way deep into the Texas plains, leaving Mercer Ranch wrapped in silence and frost. One morning, Elara Quinn stood by the kitchen window, a needle in her hand and a pile of old fabric in her lap. She sewed from scraps leather from worn saddlebags, bits of wool from a frayed blanket,
I've got you.
the lining of an old coat Caleb Mercer no longer wore. The light from the window caught the curve of her cheek as her fingers moved with careful rhythm. She was making a cloak, not for herself, but for him. She didn't need to hear the wind howling over the ridge to know the cold was on its way. From the barn doorway, Caleb watched her. Every movement she made was deliberate, steady. There was no hesitation in her, no wasted motion. The quiet between them had become its own language, one he was still learning to read. Since that night when the townsfolk came to his gate, something had changed. The air around the ranch carried a kind of peace again, though it was not the same peace as before. It had weight now shaped by choice, by trust, by the knowledge that she was still there. Each morning,
It's all right.
Elara rose before dawn and lit the stove. Coffee would be ready by the time the first streak of gray touched the horizon. She lined the chicken coop with pine needles, mended fences, and brushed the horses in long, calm circles. She even began training the yearlings using nothing but her presence and the tilt of her hands. Caleb often stopped what he was doing to watch her. The animals responded to her as though she spoke a language older than words. She could stand completely still, her palms open, and a skittish colt would draw near, trusting the quiet around her. For the first time in years, the silence at Mercer Ranch didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like listening. Late one afternoon, Caleb rode along the ridge, checking fences before the next cold front rolled in. The light was fading into that amber dusk peculiar to the plains when his horse startled maybe from a loose rock.
I've been meaning to talk to you about
maybe
something
from
important.
a scent on the wind. Either way, the animal reared, and before Caleb could steady it, he was thrown hard to the ground. His shoulder struck a frozen root, knocking the breath from his chest. He lay there a moment, staring at the sky, pain pulsing through his ribs. When he finally pushed himself up, his sleeve was slick with blood. He tore a strip of cloth and wrapped it tight around his elbow before staggering toward home. The daylight was gone by the time the cabin's shape came into view. Before he could lift his hand to the door, it opened. Elara stood there, pale against the firelight. She didn't need to see the blood to know. Somehow, she had already felt it. Without a word, she guided him to the hearth and sat him down. Her hands moved with quiet urgency, unwrapping the makeshift bandage, cleaning the wound with water, pressing a paste of pine sap and yarrow against it. Caleb watched her in stillness, her brow furrowed in concentration, the firelight turning her hair to copper. "You always know," he whispered. She paused and met his eyes. Then, in a motion so soft, he almost doubted it happened, she lifted his hand and pressed her lips against the edge of his wound, a gesture neither bold nor timid, just certain. Caleb froze. The world outside the cabin vanished the wind, the snow, the ache in his bones. For a moment, there was only the sound of the fire and the warmth of her breath against his skin. Later, as the storm rolled in and snow whispered against the windows, Caleb sat across from her at the table. He pulled a sheet of paper from his desk and wrote carefully, each letter deliberate, his hand shaking slightly. Then he turned it toward her. "I want to hear your heart." It read, "If you'll let me listen with mine." Elara studied the words. Her fingers touched the ink, tracing the letters one by one as though trying to feel what he meant. Then she looked up, eyes glistening not with sorrow, but with something deeper. She reached across the table and pressed her hand against his chest. Once, just enough, and then she smiled. It wasn't a shy smile, nor one of gratitude. It was a sunrise, a release of something long held and finally free. Outside, the storm screamed through the hills, but inside that cabin the silence bloomed into warmth. Winter held tight for weeks, but between the snow and the gray skies, life crept back into the ranch. So did something else, something steady and wordless between them. Elara began teaching Caleb how to speak with his hands. Water, fire, thank you. Her fingers moved fluidly, her gestures patient as she guided his clumsy attempts. When he fumbled, she only smiled and corrected him gently, her touch sure and kind. In return, Caleb taught her to ride. She had never been on a horse before. The first time, she clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white, her breath sharp in the cold. Caleb walked beside her, speaking low, though he knew she couldn't hear. Still, she moved with the rhythm of the mare, her body swaying in quiet harmony. They built a small room onto the cabin, that winter part shelter, part refuge. It was where they took their meals, where the fire burned soft in the evenings. They didn't need conversation. Their glances carried more than speech ever could. He noticed things about her, how she smiled when birds gathered at dusk, how she flinched at the crack of firewood, how she always knew when a storm was coming before the wind even turned. One night, as the firelight danced on the walls, Caleb signed a shaky sentence with his newly learned hands. "You make this place full." Elara stared at him for a long moment, then touched her fingers to his lips. Not a kiss, but an acknowledgement, a way of saying, "I hear you too." A week later, another storm came. The sky had been calm all evening, no hint of danger. Caleb had fallen asleep in his chair by the fire, exhaustion dragging him down after a long day mending fences. The lantern burned low. A hand touched his shoulder, gentle, urgent. He opened his eyes to see Elara standing over him, her face tight with alarm. She pointed toward the barn. Outside, the air had turned electric, the wind cut sharp, the clouds racing across the moon. In the barn, the horses were frantic, kicking at their stalls, eyes rolling white. Elara moved among them with the calm of a whisper. She placed her hands on their flanks, one by one, her presence steadying them more than any word could. Caleb grabbed a lantern, scanning the rafters just as a loud crack split the air. A beam groaned overhead, splitting where the snow had soaked through. "We need to move them," Caleb shouted. But Elara was already untying leads, ushering the horses out into the yard. Her hands signed fast, her eyes locked on his. Roof will fall now. Together, they led the panicked animals through the whipping snow, toward the smaller shelter near the house. Just as the last horse cleared the doorway, the barn gave way behind them with a thunderous crash, a wave of smoke and splinters filling the air. They stood in the storm, snow swirling around them, hearts pounding. Caleb turned to her, stunned. "How did you know?" he asked. Elara touched her chest, then pointed upward toward the dark sky. He understood. She felt it. That night, as they sat beside the fire wrapped in blankets, Caleb reached for her hand. The storm raged outside, but inside the walls the silence was deep and safe. He signed slowly, clumsily, words that she had taught him. "You belong to this land." She smiled that small, quiet smile that always seemed to hold the world in it, then placed his hand over her heart. And in that moment, Caleb Mercer felt her heartbeat beneath his palm steady, strong, alive. He realized then what he had never dared to say aloud. She might not hear the way others did, but she heard deeper than anyone he had ever known. And in her silence, he had finally found a voice that matched his own. The snow that had blanketed Abilene through the long winter finally gave way to rain. Cold, hard, honest rain that washed the dust from the fences and the sleep from the land. It came sudden, loud, like a reckoning. Caleb Mercer was out by the barn when the first drops hit, fixing a loose hinge on the corral gate. He barely had time to look up before the clouds split open. Elara Quinn was already there. She'd felt it coming hours before the sky broke. She rushed from the cabin, skirts whipping around her, her hands flashing quick in the gray light. Roof will fall now. Together, they moved the horses out through the storm, guiding them toward the small shelter by the chicken coop. The rain came down in sheets, hitting the roof like fists. The wind howled and the air smelled of pine and thunder. Just as the last horse cleared the doorway, the north beam gave way with a deep groan. The roof collapsed behind them, burying the barn in a rush of timber and ash. Caleb turned, breath ragged, water running down his face. Elara stood there, soaked through, hair plastered against her cheeks, eyes wide and shining in the flashes of lightning. She wasn't afraid. She stood steady, part of the storm, not apart from it. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. She pressed her palm to her chest, then pointed to the sky. He nodded slowly. He understood now. She didn't guess. She felt.
It's all right.
Later,
I've got you.
inside the cabin. He handed her a blanket and sat beside her by the fire. The glow caught in her wet hair, turning it to bronze. He reached for her hand and signed clumsily. "You belong to this land." Elara looked at him for a long moment before taking his hand and placing it over her heart. Beneath his palm, her pulse was steady, strong, a rhythm older than language. She smiled, soft and certain. In that moment, Caleb Mercer realized that though she could not hear the world the way he did, she heard deeper into the bones of things, into him. For the first time, he felt truly heard too. The world beyond his fences began to shift, not in noise or grand gestures, but in the quiet way that real change always begins.
All right.
The first to
I've got
come was Tom Calder, a ranch hand from the next county. His shoulder was torn from a bad fall, the doctor away in Fort Worth. One gray morning he rode up slow, reins in one hand, the other arm limp at his side. Caleb met him on the porch. "What do you need?" Tom nodded toward the garden where Elara was kneeling among her herbs. "Heard she fixes things, quiet things." Caleb studied him for a moment, then nodded. "She does." Elara came without hesitation. She examined the shoulder with patient fingers, her brow furrowing in concentration. She pressed here, there, testing for pain. Tom winced once, then sighed in relief. She wrapped the joint with steady hands, the smell of pine and sage filling the air. When she was done, he flexed his arm and gave a low whistle.
I've been meaning to
2
talk to
days
you
later,
about something important.
He came back not for help, but to return a clean bandage and leave a small sack of coffee beans by the door. Then came the widow, May Ellis, hollow-eyed from weeks without sleep. She sat on Elara's porch at dusk, her hands shaking in her lap. Elara joined her, saying nothing. She simply placed her hands on the woman's shoulders and stayed until the tremors stopped. The next morning, May returned with a pie and a knitted scarf. "For the girl," she said softly, "the one who hears more than we do." And so it went. Winter thawed, and with it, the fear that had haunted Mercer Ranch began to melt away. By spring, people from Abilene started leaving small gifts at the gate, a jar of preserves, a sack of flour, a note of thanks. The same folks who once whispered now tipped their hats when they passed on horseback. Each morning, Elara wrote on the chalkboard by the kitchen door in her neat, slanted letters, "Today will be good. I can feel it." Sometimes she was wrong. Most days, she wasn't. Then came the Sunday that changed everything. The frost had just lifted, the air clean and bright. The church bell in town rang out over the valley, its echo fading into the hills. Then came the shouting. A 7-year-old boy had vanished from his family's ranch just after morning chores. One boot was found near the tree line, half buried in mud. Nothing else. By noon, panic had gripped the town. Men fanned out with rifles. Mothers wept. Dogs barked themselves hoarse. Caleb was tightening his saddle when he saw Elara coming down the porch steps, her face calm, focused. She touched his arm, then knelt. Her palms pressed flat to the ground, first her hands, then her wrists, then her whole forearms. She stayed that way, eyes closed, feeling the earth. Then she rose, crawling forward a few feet, tracing the faintest marks of bent weed, a shifted pebble, a scuffed print too small for a man's boot. She looked up at Caleb, nodded once, and started walking. He followed. They crossed the thickets beyond the creek bed, through brush and briar, over ridges dusted with frost. Behind them came Tom Calder and 3 other men, silent but sure she knew the way. After an hour, they reached a ring of cedar trees at the edge of a clearing. There, under a bent trunk, lay the boy, curled tight, his face streaked with dirt and tears, his ankle swollen. Elara ran to him. She knelt, checked his breathing, brushed the hair from his forehead, and looked up at Caleb with a look not of triumph, but relief. The boy opened his eyes and reached for her hand. By sundown, the child was home, and when the story spread, no one called her strange anymore. They called her what she was, the girl who hears with her heart. The seasons turned again. Years passed. Mercer Ranch aged gracefully under the Texas sun. Caleb walked a little slower, and Elara's hair had silver threaded through its dark waves. They didn't keep count of time, they measured it in seasons, in the smell of rain, in moments held quietly between two hands. Children began coming from town in the mornings barefoot, wide-eyed, carrying baskets of berries or jars of milk. They came to sit with Elara in the garden. She taught them to listen not with their ears, but with their whole selves. She showed them how to tell fear from shyness in the twitch of a rabbit's nose, how to calm a nervous colt with nothing but breath and patience. She didn't teach with rules. She taught with silence. And when a child finally understood, she smiled that same soft, knowing smile that had once changed Caleb's whole world. Behind the house, beneath a wide cottonwood, Caleb had built a wooden bench. Every evening, they sat there shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun settle into the hills. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. He'd pour 2 mugs of tea from the kettle, and she'd take his hand, her thumb tracing a slow rhythm across it. Sometimes, he'd bring out his old harmonica and play a tune that had no name. Elara would close her eyes and sway gently, as if she could feel the song move through the air, through the ground, through him. The wind carried it across the prairie, soft and endless, the sound of a life rebuilt from silence, and love that spoke without words. Evening settled soft over Mercer Ranch. The sky washed in gold and violet. The wheat field shimmered under the last touch of light, and the hush that came with dusk felt sacred, the kind of quiet that only belongs to wide Texas land. Caleb Mercer stood beside Elara Quinn on the porch, watching the horizon. The years had drawn faint lines across his face, and silver threaded her dark hair, but the air between them held the same steady rhythm it always had. Elara turned toward him. Her hands rested lightly at her sides, but she didn't sign. Over the years, she had learned a little speech, just enough to shape a few careful words, to read lips, to let her voice touch the air when it mattered most. Most days she still preferred silence, but not tonight. Her voice, soft and unused, trembled like a leaf falling onto snow. "I do not need sound," she whispered. "Only you." Caleb blinked. For a long time, he said nothing. His chest tightened with the weight of everything those words meant. Then he nodded once, voice rough but sure. "I hear you," he said quietly. "Always have." They stood there until the last of the daylight slipped behind the ridge. The night gathered around them gentle, alive, and for a moment, even the wind seemed to listen. The next morning brought laughter and footprints. A new group of children arrived from town, their coats too big and their eyes bright with wonder. Elara wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside to the wooden slate nailed beside the door. Every day she wrote something new in chalk, a small promise to whoever passed by. That morning's words read, "The day will be kind." I can feel it. No one ever asked how she knew. They just believed her. In Abilene, folks no longer whispered about the girl who couldn't hear or speak. They called her something gentler, the woman who listens with her heart. Some still shook their heads, the way people do when they can't explain what's good and simple. But most smiled, brought her pies, or stayed for coffee before heading home with lighter steps. It was a quiet redemption, not dramatic, not loud, but steady, the kind that mends people from the inside out. That winter, a storm swept through the plains, fierce and sudden. The wind carried white walls of snow that swallowed fences and roads alike. Late one night, a family from the edge of town rode to Mercer Ranch, frantic. Their boy, barely 8, had gone missing at dusk. Elara said nothing. She stepped outside into the storm, knelt in the snow, and pressed her palms to the frozen earth. Her eyes closed, her breath slow. Then she lifted her head to the wind and turned west. Caleb didn't question her. He simply saddled the mare and followed. They rode 3 miles through blinding snow, past the creek and into a stand of pines. There, beneath a fallen log, they found the boy curled tight, his small body shivering but alive. Elara knelt beside him, brushed the snow from his face, and wrapped him in her shawl. By the time they returned, the sky was breaking open to dawn. No one asked her how she had known where to look. After that night, no one questioned her at all. Spring returned slow and golden. The wheat stretched high, and the air smelled of rain and sun-warmed hay. Caleb and Elara walked the pasture most evenings, the same way they had from the start, side by side, unhurried, talking little. A mare grazed nearby with her foal, and the air shimmered with light. At the crest of the hill, Elara stopped. Well, for a moment she watched the horizon. Then she laughed, not loud, not forced, but a laugh that rolled out of her like sunlight breaking through clouds. Caleb turned to her, startled by the sound. It was rare, beautiful, like something he had been waiting to hear all his life. He smiled, stepped close, and kissed her temple. She leaned into him, eyes half closed. The laughter still caught between them. No one ever told their story in full. They didn't need to. It lived on quietly in the town that had once feared her, in the children who learned from her hands, in the land that still carried the echo of their steps. Sometimes, the truest love isn't the kind shouted from rooftops. It's the kind that walks beside you in silence, that listens when no one else does, that holds you without asking to be seen. If you've ever looked at someone and felt your heart pause because they understood without a word, then you already know their story. Because the story of Caleb Mercer and Elara Quinn isn't one of miracles or noise. It's a story about how love doesn't need sound, to be heard only 2 souls brave enough to feel. Out on the quiet plains of the American West, where the wind and silence speak the same language, a lonely rancher and a girl the world once called deaf found something stronger than sound. They built a life not of words, but of touch, of glances, of hearts that learned how to listen. And even now,
I've been meaning to talk to you about something
when the wind drifts low
important.
across the wheat and the cottonwoods sigh, it carries a faint memory of them, the rancher who spoke in quiet truths, and the woman who heard the world with her soul. Their love never asked to be remembered. It simply was, and that was enough. Lonely rancher, bought a deaf girl, reminds us that true listening goes far beyond sound. As we grow older, we come to understand that words are only the surface of connection. What matters is presence, empathy, and patience. Caleb and Elara's story shows that love is not built on what is spoken, but on what is felt. Many of us spend a lifetime surrounded by noise voices, opinions, regrets, yet still feel unheard. This story whispers a quiet truth. Peace doesn't come from being loud enough to be noticed, but from being kind enough to be understood. For those of us over 60, it's a gentle reminder that silence isn't emptiness. It can be the space where love, forgiveness, and healing finally find room to breathe. Whether it's a friend, a partner, or a memory long buried, listen, not with your ears, but with your heart. Because sometimes the people who seem silent are the ones carrying the deepest stories. Thank you for sharing this quiet journey with us. If Caleb and Elara's story touched something in your heart, a memory, a kindness, a silence that once spoke louder than words, we'd love for you to stay with us. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Wild West Love Stories, where every tale reminds us that love, in all its forms, is still worth listening to. See you in the next story, and until then, keep your heart open.